Every reputable Churchill historian has debunked all of this. But if you're a person who is essentially defending Adolf Hitler, minimizing his responsibility for the Second World War, I think you actually have gone perhaps down a very, very dark rabbit hole.
So, Rafe, I think that this has come at a fantastic time because there's been a massive historical debate happening over the last few weeks when Daryl Cooper went on Tucker Carlson's podcast and labeled Winston Churchill the chief villain of World War II, which is a very, very interesting take. It's not a take that I've heard before. However, I will say that I listened to Daryl Cooper's Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem podcast, which was 30 hours long, and I found it fantastic. I was really impressed by it. I learned a lot, researched a lot from it, and he's obviously got this World War II take coming out soon, which is not a take that I've really heard before. What was your instant reaction to that?
Unfortunately, there was nothing new in what Daryl Cooper has said. He hasn't uncovered anything new. This is all, I would say sort of neo-Nazi sympathizing of the worst sort of revisionist kind. We've had it before with David Irving and others. Most mainstream, I suppose, would have been Pat Buchanan spouting this, but every reputable Churchill historian has debunked all of this. And if you are a person, I would say, I haven't heard his piece on the New Jerusalem and so forth, but if you're a person who is essentially defending Adolf Hitler, minimizing his responsibility for the Second World War, excusing some of the things that went on under his watch, and at the same time simultaneously attacking Winston Churchill, I think you need to have a long period of self-reflection and asking yourself whether you actually have gone perhaps down a very, very dark rabbit hole. And I say that not only of Daryl Cooper, I also say that of Tucker Carlson himself. I'm a free speech advocate. I'm a free speech absolutist. I don't believe anybody should be silenced or not given a platform, because the public forum is actually the place where you can expose the ludicrous nature of some of these claims. And, if you just silence them, and I think many people want to see done, and take people's videos off of YouTube, all you do is you give certain elements within our society the feeling that there must be something to it. If the mainstream media and others are so quick to silence these people, that must mean that there is some kernel of truth at the bare minimum to what they're saying. So sunlight is, obviously the best disinfectant. So I don't have an issue with Tucker Carlson platforming this guy. But what I do have an issue with in this debate, before we get into Daryl Cooper's own points, is that Tucker Carlson gave this man such undue praise. Literally, he called him the best, the most honest, and the most important historian in America. And, that for anyone who has been a historian for years, that's quite a jaw-dropping statement to make, because no leading historian that I've ever seen has ever heard of this man before. He exists entirely online. Great historians of the right, Niall Ferguson, Victor Davis Hanson, Andrew Roberts, they've never heard of him before. They've all now come out and debunked his claims. He's not a historian. He has not written a single history book. He has never studied history. He's not trained in the skills of a historian. I doubt he's been within 100 feet of an archive. And I suppose what you would have to say is, if you're being generous, you call him an amateur historian. I would prefer to call him somebody who's a history enthusiast. And I'm afraid all the stuff that he's been coming out with in these interviews is essentially second-hand knowledge, which is essentially a regurgitation of books that we've had in the past. So I don't like this sort of, the hagiography around this guy that Tucker Carlson has said. And I think it behooved him, if he's going to give this man a platform, he should actually have challenged the views that he made. It's one thing to give somebody a platform, but if you are a skilled interviewer, even if you agree with the person you're interviewing, it's your duty. You have almost, when you're Tucker Carlson and you have such a large platform, you have a fiduciary duty, I would say, given how devoted your followers are to you, to actually really challenge this guy on what he's saying. And you can tell that this person isn't a real historian, because you mentioned there was an interview yesterday on television with Piers Morgan and Andrew Roberts. This BBC channel actually invited Daryl Cooper to take part in a debate on this channel for 5, 10, 15 minutes with Andrew Roberts, and he declined because He said, "I respect Andrew Roberts. He knows far more about Churchill than I do, and I know that I would lose." And I find that remarkable, because if you are coming out with something so incendiary, if you are making such controversial claims about a world figure, if you're actually boosting Nazi sympathizers with the attacks that you're making, you surely have a moral duty to actually stand by what you're saying and face up to a Churchill historian and say, well, look, this is my position. These are the facts. These are the claims. This is the evidence to back it up. And the fact that he didn't feel comfortable enough or secure enough in his knowledge to actually spend just 5 or 10 minutes explaining his point against a real Churchill historian, I shows you why this is thoroughly rotten. It's morally bankrupt, and it's very irresponsible and reckless of someone like him to say these things, given how many people who follow him will just follow him blindly.
Well, I think that the debate would definitely be something that I would love to see if he were to take Andrew Roberts up on that debate, because when you do make those claims in such a big platform and a public forum, I mean, go for it, but you have to be able to back it up 100%.
Exactly.
And I do believe that Daryl Cooper will do that debate, because, he's getting a lot of criticism at the moment. But I will say, from what I've listened to of his podcasts, they are very insightful. And he does seem to be a guy who, at the very least, and if you might not call him a historian, but he reads a lot, and he's come up with his own perspectives. And I do hope that happens. That would be amazing to see. But in terms of the claims themselves, Rafe, just to sort of play devil's advocate a little bit here, I think that some of the events that he's talking about are, for example, the bombing of Dresden and the internment camps set up in peacetime. And then obviously there's been a lot of there's been documentaries circulating recently about the BBC documentary about what the Allies did during peacetime. And it's sort of reinvigorated this discussion about whether or not the Allies were really the good guys in the war. And at the very least, the discussion should be allowed to happen. And I'm glad that it is happening. But on terms of those claims on their face, do you think that those were war crimes as well? And do you think that there are events in World War II that we can look at and say the Allies were wrong there and they actually committed war crimes themselves?
Yeah, so look, for example, Dresden, classic example here. Look, my family are Polish, but actually my family are ethnic Germans originally, and they came from Dresden. They left Dresden in 1697 to go down to Poland. What happened to Dresden was absolutely, I would say, in hindsight, absolutely unforgivable. But of course, we have to see things within the context of their time. Churchill himself was haunted by Dresden. The key thing to remember about Churchill was he learned a great lesson in the First World War at Gallipoli, which of course, being Australian will be very close to your hearts too. And after Gallipoli and the Dardanelles campaign, he ensured that in the Second World War, he would not overrule his military commanders. And so Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, the future Labour Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition against him, said also that one of the reasons Churchill was a great leader, a great wartime leader and strategist, is he solved the dilemma that always handicaps democracies and war. And that's the battle between the elected leadership and the military leadership. Churchill felt confident enough to he learned that the mistakes of the First World War were also that battle between the government and between the military hampered severely the Allies in their war against Germany and so forth. And so in the Second World War, you didn't have that. That's one of the reasons why the Allies, why Britain and America were actually so much more successful in the war compared to, say, in Germany, where Hitler was always interfering, just being a corporal and yet overruling his field marshals and generals and so forth, getting too involved. Churchill took a back seat, and he was opposed to the idea of this sort of aerial bombardment for Dresden, also for the Ruhr as well. But he was, but in the end, he had to agree with what his military leaders and military commanders said. And for them, for the military commanders, it was a legitimate target because Dresden was actually the center of communications and transport for that part of Germany. And there was a very real expectation that German forces would withdraw then to Dresden and make their last stand there. This is what Bomber Harris explained to Churchill as one of the justifications for it. And also at the same time, you had pressure from Russia because Russia were trying to make their offensive into Germany, and they wanted essentially to have the pathway before them flattened and made easier for their advance. And Dresden was one of the key areas which would have posed an obstacle to the Russians. Similarly, you can also make an argument that, the terrible, incendiary bombing of Dresden and so forth, horrific as they were, pale in comparison to the Americans' attack on, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, pale in comparison to the Japanese murder of the Chinese, and of course, pale in comparison to the Nazis' murder, obviously, of the Jews and others. But that's not to excuse it. And Churchill actually had tears in his eyes when he was discussing what happened in Dresden to his son, Randolph Churchill, at the time. And it was one of the great, and when it came to the Ruhr bombing, he gave a speech, read a pamphlet saying, "Are we beasts? And have we gone too far?" So yeah, there's absolutely genuine areas for debate and criticism. And that's part of the broader point here, because Churchill wasn't perfect. No one is perfect. So there are areas you can debate. You can debate Churchill tying Britain to the gold standard when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. You could debate Churchill's policy on India. You could debate Churchill and the abdication crisis. You could obviously discuss Churchill in Gallipoli and the Dardanelles. But what you can't do is you can't make the sorts of claims that Daryl Cooper makes in his interview with Carlson. I didn't hear Dresden raised. I heard him talking about the Black Forest bombing. I didn't hear him make Dresden. But the points that he makes in his talk, simply no decent historian would ever make those points, because they're essentially factually incorrect. And we can go into if you'd like to do those key points that he makes in his speech.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we definitely should. But when you look at World War II, though, it's such a dark and disgusting part of human history. And one of the things on the micro level, when you look at people who return from war, they generally have PTSD, and PTSD because of what they've seen, but also PTSD because of what they've done. That's another big part of why people return from war, with PTSD. And then I think that there's a real hangover when you go to war and then you come home and you realize, gosh, like it's terrible what human beings are capable of. But then with World War II, we have that on such a bigger scale, where we're all sort of looking back on it even 80 years later, thinking, I can't believe that our people were involved in that. Were we lied to about the narrative? So as bad as it is an interesting discussion to be having with a historian, for me anyway. But yeah, definitely, let's get into some of those claims specifically that you noted.
Yeah, all right. Well, I mean, just on the more silly and superficial level, he said, he accused Churchill of being a psychopath. Well, I'm sorry, psychopaths don't have empathy or emotion. I've just described to you Churchill crying when he was discussing what happened in Dresden. Similarly, when he heard about the fate of the Jews. There are so many examples during the Second World War. Even Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, remarks about how Churchill was so visibly moved when he heard about the atrocities and horrors of wartime Europe and what was going on there. Also, just when he was received by the crowds in Britain, he got emotionally taken up by all of that. He was a deeply romantic man. He was a character from the 18th century in terms of very visibly displaying his emotions, much like Admiral Lord Nelson didn't have any problem being seen weeping or so forth. So he had so much humanity for people. The idea that he was a psychopath is simply stupid. You also, Daryl Cooper, who is just an online presence only in sort of on Substack and podcasts, also accuses Winston Churchill of being childish. This is a man who had won the Nobel Prize for Literature, led 2 governments, was a liberal reformer with David Lloyd George, fought in 5 wars, was a great buccaneer. I mean, of all the people in the world you could call childish, Churchill is the last one. He bestrode the globe as a great towering figure, and you don't get that by being childish. But getting onto the other points that he makes, so he says that, for example, Churchill expanded the war beyond Poland. Well, I'm sorry, Winston Churchill was not the one who did that. That there was a phony war for 8 months between September the 3rd, 1939, and for the next 8 months until May 1940, when Hitler invaded the Low Countries and France. Churchill wasn't prime minister at this time. It was Hitler who expanded the war beyond Poland into Western Europe. What else did he do? Well, he also demonizes, when Churchill then became prime minister with Chamberlain stepping down, and Daryl Cooper says that Churchill demonized Chamberlain. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, what did Churchill do? Chamberlain felt broken. Churchill brought Chamberlain back into the cabinet immediately, and Chamberlain became one of his great supporters because finally the scales had fallen from Chamberlain's eyes. He realized you could not appease Hitler. That would not work. And when Chamberlain died, Churchill delivered one of the greatest speeches of his life when he paid tribute to him and delivered that eulogy. So a completely nonsensical thing for him to say there. He then goes into the whole aspect of the peace parleys that Count Ciano, the Italian, was conducting on behalf of the Nazis with the British in terms of could we get a peace settlement with Britain, and that these were rejected and rebuffed by Britain and also by France, it has to be said. And it's no surprise that these were going to be rebuffed. The first thing was, by the time you were having these peace treaties, these peace negotiations started by Hitler through his intermediaries, Hitler realized that he couldn't actually successfully invade Britain at that point. Britain, was very extremely weak. It had lost lost the continent of Europe, but the Royal Navy was still the world's largest fleet. Hitler wasn't able to secure mastery in the air, and without being able to neutralize the British fleet, without mastery in the air, it was clear that the path to victory over Britain wasn't obvious. There was no way to do an invasion, and so Hitler quite obviously wanted to turn his attention instead onto Russia and focus 100% of his energy on Russia. He thought that would be easier. They thought they could do it in a matter of days, knock Russia out of the war, and with Russia knocked out of the war, they could then come back and focus their energy on Britain 100% too. And, with the scale of Russia's decline, hopefully even get Britain to negotiate a better peace treaty. But of course, the British knew full well that they would be vassals to Hitler. You often are told, oh, Hitler loved Britain. He wanted Britain to keep its empire and so forth. He didn't love Britain. He didn't like Britain. He admired Britain. He had huge admiration for Britain and the way that Britain developed its empire. But make no mistake, if Britain had had a peace deal with Germany, particularly at that point when Germany was master of Europe, Britain would have been a vassal state, would probably have had to surrender its fleet, or its fleet would have gone over to Canada. And there's every chance that you would have had a quisling government in place in Britain, perhaps led by Oswald Mosley of the British Union of Fascists, or a sort of Vichy Pétain, David Lloyd George, a sort of a Vichy France style thing, essentially another sort of quisling to Adolf Hitler. And you would be living at the point of a gun next to some sort of schizophrenic, because you have to remember, Hitler tore up every single peace treaty, every single treaty that he signed. He went into the Rhineland, he went into the Sudetenland, he then tore up that Munich Agreement and went into all of Czechoslovakia. He then, he tore up the Nazi Soviet non-aggression pact and invaded Russia. There was no treaty that he didn't tear up. There is no reason to suspect that he would have adhered to or abided by the peace treaty terms with Britain, because remember, he also had Napoleon always in the back of his mind. When he conquered Paris, when he famously went to Paris, he went to the Pantheon, he stood over Napoleon's tomb, and he described that as the finest and most important moment of his life. And he wanted to achieve what Napoleon couldn't achieve, conquering Russia and conquering Britain. That had stumped Napoleon, and I have no doubt that if he had in fact, Joseph Stalin and Nikita Khrushchev both said that if Britain had been defeated, or if Britain had had peace terms with Germany, Germany would have had 100% of its forces against Russia, compared to only having 70%, as it turned out in the Second World War. And if it had been a single front war between Russia and between the Soviet Union and Germany, Stalin and Khrushchev both said Hitler would have won. And that meant that the Axis powers in Germany would have controlled Europe, they would have controlled Russia, they would have controlled the Middle East oil fields, they would have controlled Africa, and with Japan, they would have controlled Asia. And of course, once they had coalesced and restored their forces after fighting Russia, how could Britain have possibly withstood that complete domination. And then conquering Britain as well, the Axis powers could look towards America. That's why you had FDR's famous Arsenals of Democracy speech, where he said, if Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control Africa, Australia, Asia, and we in the Americas will be living at the point of a gun. And the other important thing to mention there is that, of course, the British scientists were the ones who helped the Americans with the Manhattan Project for nuclear weapons. If Germany had conquered Britain, those tube alloy scientists who were developing nuclear weapons would have worked with the Germans, and the Germans would most probably have got the nuclear bomb first, and then we'd be talking about a very different world indeed. So I think it's quite immature to attribute Hitler's motives as being completely altruistic in reaching out for a peace agreement.
It's interesting when I look at I haven't actually thought about it from that regard in terms of his sort of admiration of Napoleon and him wanting to follow in Napoleon's footsteps, because the way that when I look at Hitler, I think that his prime enemy was Bolshevism in Russia, and Europe was under this sort of Bolshevism versus fascism battle, and that he wanted to defeat the Bolsheviks and create this new sort of Third Reich. I guess he wanted to create the new great Roman society, and then Britain was just sort of, it wasn't necessarily a primary enemy of his, but it was just a hindrance to his goal. So I haven't really thought about it that way. But you're saying that Britain was just as much of an enemy to Hitler as the Soviets were?
No, not just as much of an enemy. Britain wasn't an enemy. Bolshevik Russia was an enemy. He had, of course, grievances with France, which is why, of course, he had the French sign their peace treaty in the railway coach at Compiègne, which, of course, was the site of the great humiliation of Germany after World War One. But Hitler was a conqueror, and once he had complete domination of the continent of Europe, this was still a man who thought about Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon. He saw himself in those sorts of messianic, giants of history's term, and he was thinking about his global legacy. And there's no reason to think that this is not actually how the game would have ended. We know that's how it would have gone. And of course, the other point to make here is that all the time we're talking about potential peace negotiations or a peace treaty. If Britain had signed a peace treaty with Germany, we're forgetting about all of the nations of Europe that were under the Nazi jackboot. We're not talking about just the Jews. We're talking about the Slavs, who were essentially going to be the slave labor, who were also being murdered, in the most gruesome and brutal ways, also put into concentration camps. We're talking about the free peoples of Europe, in Western Europe, who were also having democracy extinguished and living under the totalitarian regime enforced by the Gestapo and so forth. So there's none of this was discussed by Daryl Cooper or Tucker Carlson. The reality of what the peoples of Europe would be left to had Britain actually decided to surrender, or if Britain had been defeated. There are very few times in history when the expression "cometh the hour, cometh the man" is more important. And I don't think there was another point in world history where the future of Western civilization and the free world rested upon one man's shoulders, as it did for the 12 months from the fall of France and Dunkirk in May-June 1940 up to Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. That year, Britain, along with its empire, but in terms of the continent of Europe, Britain stood alone, with resources so slender you can't even begin to imagine it. And that year gave the world the chance to rearm and prepare for the war. And it kept the flame of freedom and liberty burning until the miracles of Russian and American engagement were allowed to happen, which of course ended up signing the death warrant of Adolf Hitler. But do remember, Hitler invaded Russia. Hitler declared war on America. Churchill didn't drag America into that war, although he really wanted America to come in. That was an initiative of Adolf Hitler there. But again, even with Daryl Cooper, he actually says, bizarrely, that Hitler didn't regard Russia as being any longer the center of communist international movement, which is, of course, you're quite correct, completely wrong with all of the historical evidence we know. He also says that that Hitler invaded Russia because he thought Stalin was to preempt an attack by Stalin, and that he was worried that Stalin was going to invade Romania's oil fields. I'm sorry, the man clearly hasn't read Mein Kampf, because it's quite clear. We all know about Lebensraum and the policy that Hitler had for giving living space to the Germanic peoples, and that included settling Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, and having an exodus of the population through there. And he ridiculously says that the reason so many Russian prisoners of war died was because the Germans weren't prepared to have so many prisoners of war and didn't know where or how to house them. I mean, that's absolutely outrageous. This is sort of, first year university level essay submission. It's all there in the documentary evidence. We can see that the deliberate policy of the Germans was to expunge and eradicate the Russians, especially with food shortages being so slow. They wanted to exterminate as many Slavs as possible. We saw that in Poland. In fact, members of my own family who were part of the intelligentsia, the clear policy of the Germans was to eradicate the Polish elite, the Polish officer class, and also do that to the Russian officer class and Russian elite, so there wouldn't be any chance of a counterfight from them, and then to basically remove the masses of the population. And Cooper somehow glides over all of that and says it's because the Germans were poorly prepared. Either he's being rather disingenuous there, or he just simply doesn't know his history.
And another one that gets talked about quite a lot in this discussion is the unholy alliance between the Allies and between the Soviets to defeat the Nazis. When you see the old footage, the old black and white footage of Churchill and Stalin together making alliances, strange bedfellows to say the least, considering the ideological differences. And then also during peacetime, when what the Soviets did to the Germans when they infiltrated German land. So upon reflection, was that something that we can look back at as an unholy alliance and something that shouldn't have taken place, or was that a necessary evil?
It was absolutely fundamental. If Germany, one of the things behind appeasement, of course, everybody was hoping that before Hitler became had too much of an appetite for domination in the West, that fascism and communism would go to war. All the democracies were hoping that these two great evil ideologies would go head to head against each other. And if that hadn't happened on the Eastern Front, then, the war would have been extremely different. You've got to remember, of course, that the Russians took the great brunt of Nazi power, and the Russian front was much more severe, as you well know, than on the Western Front. But look, my enemy's enemy is my friend. There was no greater foe of Bolshevism than Winston Churchill. When after the Russian Revolution, he said that we should strangle the baby Bolshevism in its cradle. He wanted to actually, launch a war against the Bolsheviks. His whole life was dedicated to fighting communism. But as he said in the House of Commons, when he was asked about allying with Stalin, he said, well, if Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. So you have to understand who your greater enemy is. And what you see about Churchill is that at the end of the Second World War in 1945, when American forces were still on the ground in Europe, Churchill wanted to launch what's called Operation Unthinkable. He wanted British, Polish, and American forces, along, I suppose, with the Canadians who were also there. He wanted them to push further into Germany, past Berlin, push into Poland, and push the Red Army out of Europe. Churchill saw the threat from the communists. He wanted to, now that the Nazis, who were the number one threat, had gone, he wanted to push communism out of Europe. But by that point, the military, the armies of America were so tired. The war had been raging for so long. It was so expensive. And they didn't see Bolshevism for the danger that Churchill did. Churchill was far more clued in. And of course, so if we had followed him, the map of Europe could have been very different, and the Iron Curtain would have been pushed much further east. Perhaps there would have been no Iron Curtain. And who coined the phrase Iron Curtain? Churchill in 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, in America. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. It was Churchill who was the first person to make the world aware of the true intentions of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, just as it was Churchill who had been the first person to warn the world about the evils of Adolf Hitler and his true plans. And of course, as he was also in the First World War, he was one of the first to also warn about the impending clouds of war gathering in 1914. So there's every reason to look towards him as being one of those few people gifted with the foresight to see the world around him as it really was.
Right. And in terms of Churchill's own character, the other things that have come into scrutiny is that saying that he was a drunk, and we debunked about him being childish and being a psychopath. But was his decisions, were they hindered at all by his affinity for alcohol and cigars?
No, look, no one is going to say that Churchill didn't drink a lot. Kindred spirit of mine on that front, absolutely. But, you know, as he often said, I've taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me. And as Andrew Roberts has shown, having gone through all of the Churchill archives, there's only one day in the 6 years of the Second World War when he was believed to have been tipsy. So amazing, given all the pressures he was under in 1939 to 1945, only one day was he actually thought to be tipsy, and all they did was they just held the meeting again the next day. Churchill famously, you know, used to enjoy having champagne at breakfast. But, you know, I got to know his daughter, Mary Soames, and she said what he would drink throughout the morning and afternoon was what we called Papa's cocktail. And it was a Scotch and whiskey, but the whiskey was essentially just, you know, enough to cover the bottom of the glass. The rest of it was water. So essentially it was called what his secretary, Jock Colville, called, it was mouthwash. It was just water with a splash of whiskey in it, hardly, you know, alcoholic at all, something that many people from his era learned when they were in the British Empire. If you were in India and Africa and elsewhere, you couldn't trust the water so much. You would put a splash of alcohol in it to try to sterilize it. He acquired a taste for it. So whilst you would see him with a glass, the fact is it was probably in about 1% or 0% alcohol. Not true. So again, these are just canards that have come up, that he was a drunken and so forth. Hitler liked to perpetuate this. People who are sympathizers with Hitler, and also people on the far left, like to support these sorts of crazy ways to denigrate and besmirch his reputation. But I'm afraid they simply don't hold true.
Yes, and I think that there are a lot of people who enjoy alcohol a little bit more than they should, and it doesn't really affect their character too much.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that's been popping up recently, I've seen when this debate has been happening on Twitter, a lot of people have been posting Winston Churchill's articles that he was writing about Zionism and Bolshevism being the battle for the Jewish heart, or the battle for the Jewish soul or identity. What was that all about?
So, well, it was undeniable that many Bolsheviks were Jewish, but, you know, as Churchill would have said, many Bolsheviks are Jews, but most Jews aren't Bolsheviks. Churchill was very rare and unique for his time, for a 19th century Victorian gentleman to be a philo-Semite rather than an anti-Semite, as were most of his compatriots at the time. His father had Jewish friends. Churchill had great Jewish friends growing up and then throughout his life. And he regarded the Jews as being a remarkable minority who had achievements that were far out of proportion to the size of their demographic. And he saw the Western civilization as having many of its roots were fundamentally, in his view, came out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so he had great affinity to the Jews, much more than, say, to the Arabs. And so, you know, there's no denying what he said. You've got to remember, of course, this was a man who was born in the era of Charles Darwin, who believed in the hierarchy of races and so forth, which was entirely normal for the time. However abhorrent people may find that today, that was just accepted science of the time. And he quite clearly said, you know, if it wasn't, Palestine and these regions in the Arab world would have remained unchanged for tens of thousands of years if they had been left to their own devices. You wouldn't have verdant gardens and all of the architecture and the civilization there if they had been left to their own devices that the British brought there. And then with the state of Israel being created, that was then also able to create a prosperous nation which had previously been barren and desert-like. And so he made no secret of his great admiration for the genius of the Jews, particularly, he would say, compared to their neighbors.
If you enjoyed that reality-based podcast clip, make sure to subscribe to the reality-based YouTube channel. We'll be uploading mini clips and the full podcast. And also,
If you prefer the audible version, you can check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts at Reality Based.